Yes.
Is there any specificity anywhere which lends itself to definition of a family member, sort of like, the third cousin through marriage kind of thing? And how do you know what constitutes a legitimate family member?
Thanks. So the question is, what's a good question in Rhode Island? Right? So, and there could be a lot of different definitions. Some of us might consider our family to be our immediate family, or maybe our nuclear family. And in some states, that's what family member means. It's very narrow. But believe it or not, in the littlest state, we have the broadest definition of family member. It goes all the way out to first cousins. So, your family are of course, your parents and children and siblings, brothers and sisters, grandparents, grandchildren, aunts and uncles, nieces and nephews, first cousins, not second cousins, first cousins. And that is what family is. But, as they say in the infomercials, that's not all. There's a little bit more to it. Are you married? Well, add in-law to every one of those. Uncle-in-law, niece-in-law, nephew-in-law, first cousin-in-law. These are all considered members of your family for purposes of the conflict of interest rules. So if it's a decision that impacts your wife's nephew, it counts as something in Rhode Island. And if that's not enough, let me just add household member. So if someone lives with you, we don't care if you're related to them. We're going to treat them just like a family member. Even if it's not a romantic type relationship, even if you're just renting out your basement to some stranger. Does he live in your house? Family member. And we're going to count it. I hope that's not happening for anyone.
So if you're going to explain the nuance of negotiating a contract where you may have a family member of that bargaining unit, my understanding, and it could be incorrect, is that you can't serve on the subcommittee to directly negotiate that contract, but you can vote on the overall contract if you're a member of the school committee. Is that accurate?
It is. So a few years ago, and this is what the code said for years and years and years, but we would always have questions from school committees particularly, but also from town councils about two different particular issues. How do I handle the budget if I've got someone who is impacted by the budget that I'm related to? And how do I handle collective bargaining and contract negotiations if I've got a family member who's a member of the collective bargaining unit? And this comes up in every single city and town, right? It just, part of the reason why people are interested in serving on school committees and being involved in education is because they have people that are close to them that are involved in education and school issues. So it always happens. So a few years ago, the commission adopted some very specific regulations that aren't any different than this, but just use language which is much more specific to your situation. One having to do with how to deal with budgets, and one having to deal with how to deal with collective bargaining. So the rules for both of these, which are consistent with what I just told you, let's start with collective bargaining, since that's what you mentioned. If you have a family member that is part of a bargaining unit that your committee or your district is negotiating at the time, the rule is, number one, as you said, you may not be part of that negotiating committee. So when the team is formed, we're going to have one or two members of the school committee and maybe the superintendent and the finance director and the solicitor, whatever it is you pick. You're not going to be one of those people if your daughter is an elementary school teacher, or if your niece is a bus monitor and you're negotiating the bus monitor contracts. So whichever unit it is, you can't be part of that negotiating team. You can't be part of that negotiating process. However, consistent with the class exception I just talked about, when the time comes for the school committee to vote on that contract, you may now step back in and participate. As long as what you're voting on are the broad strokes of the contract and not delving back down into, hey, let's get back into whether we should give health insurance to bus monitors. You know, but should we pass this agreement in whole, thumbs up or thumbs down? You're allowed to vote. And the reason is because it's broad enough, it's not just directed at your one family member. That's how we deal with collective bargaining. For budgets, it's very similar. If you have a family member that is impacted by the school department budget, by one of the line items somewhere in there, what the code now says is that you can't participate in the board's discussion on that line item, if there even is a discussion on that line item. There may well not be. But if there is, you need to recuse. You have a conflict. But once you're talking about approving the entire budget or maybe an entire budget article, and that's just one line in that entire article, you're allowed to step back in and participate again. And again, that's because it's consistent with the class exception. Everyone get that? Question?
So I believe we've asked this question, the former, the one about the family member negotiating and the class exception. And I believe what was brought back to us is that when you're going into a negotiations subcommittee, you're not acting as a voting member. You're 3 of 7. Therefore, the impact that you're having is only forwarding a vote to the body of 7. So you're not actually making any agreement in that small negotiations subcommittee. And then by the time you get to the larger vote, we have 300 teachers. So within the 300 teachers, if this gentleman's brother is one of those teachers, then they get the class exemption.
I'm not sure that I understand the first part. If you're saying that it's okay to, are you saying that,
So
that you...
we were told it's okay to participate, and this is why. Because when you're on a negotiating subcommittee, it's not a quorum. We have a body of 7. 3 of the school committee members who are acting on behalf of the body of 7. The body of 7 has put forth the proposal, and then the 3 that are in the subcommittee work out the details of the proposal, but no one is actually taking action within that negotiating
I have to
subcommittee.
say, I don't think so. I can't,
So we're
I'm
kind
not,
of like in
I'm not
this right
familiar
now.
with that opinion, and,
Okay.
and I'm skeptical about it, I have to say.
Okay.
So if I were a member of a school committee and I had a family member impacted by a contract, and I was asked to be on a negotiating subcommittee, I would not do it without getting an advisory opinion from the Ethics Commission. So if you want to point me to that advisory opinion, I'll be glad to take a second look at it or take a look at it to see if it says what you think it says, but I
you.
don't think it
And
does.
can I give you another scenario?
Yes.
So if I'm a retired teacher and I receive health benefits from said current contract, we were told that as long as the retired teacher sort of splices the vote of the contract to say, let's vote on the contract, absent the part of retired teacher benefit, and then I'll recuse myself from that part.
That sounds right.
Okay.
So that's a case where you're recusing from the line item that impacts you, but once the entire contract, the budget comes before you for a thumbs up or a thumbs down, you're participating again. So that sounds correct. Got a question, or was that answered? Okay. Okay.
All right. I've been the recipient of a formal opinion from the Ethics Commission regarding family member in the bargaining unit. And I really want to see if I'm understanding correctly. My understanding in this situation is I am completely and totally excluded as a family member from participating in any contract negotiations for that family member's union as long as that person's still an employee. Now, that also includes the retiree part of it, is what I understand. Now, my opinion told me that I could vote on the whole contract at the end, okay? But it also was very specific. I could not participate in the negotiation process whatsoever until there was a final contract to be voted on by the school committee as a whole. Am I correct about that?
Yeah, that sounds correct.
Okay.
You're
Thanks,
not
Jason.
participating in negotiations. But once the team comes back with a recommendation, we want you to pass this entire thing, then yes, you're back in the mix. You know, it's difficult. You know, the commission did its best to try and fashion some type of rule that would work, that would still allow people, you know, that would recognize the varied interests in a school department and the interests that should be in a school department, while still restricting the most bad parts of it. So if you have questions about that, contact the Ethics Commission. We'll be glad to walk you through it a little bit more.
One last on, can a legal counsel who's involved with the bargaining of the actual team that's bargaining the contract have family members in the bargaining unit?
Oh. The question is, what about when legal counsel, the school committee says, we want our legal counsel to sit in on the negotiations, and the legal counsel has a family member that's part of the bargaining unit. So here, always asking tough questions when there's a camera on me. Let's see. So here I would look at it one of two ways. And let me start by making a very lawyerly comment. It depends. And it depends on what kind of legal counsel you have. So sometimes a board might have independent legal counsel. It's just some lawyer that the board has hired to represent them, and it's an independent contracting kind of relationship, but that lawyer is not a solicitor, is not a public official. It's just a private attorney that is representing the school committee. That attorney is not subject to the Code of Ethics. A private attorney who you just hire to represent you to do something is not subject to the code. On the other hand, a solicitor is a municipal appointed official. Municipal appointed officials are subject to the Code of Ethics. So I would say if it's a solicitor or assistant solicitor that you're tasking with that, they need to comply with the provisions that I discussed about not participating in negotiations. If it's a private attorney, the same conflict exists, we just don't have jurisdiction to enforce it. So I would, as the school board, I might have some concerns over that, but it not because it violates the code, just because it might call into question the fairness or the bias of that negotiator.
If the lawyer has not been appointed by the town, and in fact, we as school committees can appoint our own lawyer, and we can accept what our town council, our town administrator might want as our lawyer, but if it is separate from that, then again, it's more private and not considered?
Well, this is a legal question that we need to look into the agreement between the school department and the attorney.
Okay.
And it's not necessarily an ethics question as much as it is almost a contract question. Is this person just an independent you could hire an accountant to audit your books. You could hire a CPA to come in, on the outside just to check and make sure you're doing something right. These people aren't subject to the code. They're vendors. So if this attorney is a vendor, then not subject to the code.